How might we enable human flourishing in American education system? I'm Pinar Gavanch, and welcome to What's Wrong With the podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of chatting with Erin Mote. Erin is the CEO and founder of InnovateEDU. In this role, Erin leads the organization and its major projects, including its policy and strategy portfolio. She leads the organization's work on creating uncommon alliances to create systems change in special education, talent development, artificial intelligence, and data modernization. An enterprise architect, she created alongside her team two of InnovateEDU's signature technology products, Cortex, a next-generation personalized learning platform, and Landing Zone, a cutting-edge infrastructure as a service data product. Enjoy. Erin, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here and for our conversation.
Thank you for being here and making the time. We're very excited for our conversation. So before we kick it off, to introduce yourself to our audience, can you share a little bit of your background and how you came to where you are today?
It's a long and winding path, which I'm sure is something that's shared by many of your listeners. And so, I'm an enterprise architect by training, which I think always strikes people as kind of an interesting path into education. But for me, it really makes sense because it means I only can think in systems. And so before I entered education, where I founded a school in Brooklyn, New York, and did a lot of work really at InnovateEDU on advancing large-scale alliances for data interoperability, safe AI, educator pathways. I worked in international development and national security, focused on connecting communities across the globe. And so folks always kind of say, well, that was a right turn. But for me, that right turn from national security and international development into education makes a lot of sense, because thing that I will say is I think education, at least in the United States, is our greatest national security crisis right now. And that young people have the ability to move from schooling experiences towards learning experiences. And there needs to be that distinction between what we're doing in terms of building core academic knowledge, still very important, but what are the types of learning experiences that we're giving young people, and frankly, like all learners, to navigate increasing uncertainty in the world of work and in the world of technology.
Oh my God, so many things I want to unpack there already.
Yeah.
First of all, as a systems theory geek, and my background is in systems engineering, so I love that you come from such a systems thinking background into this space, because I feel like being able to see even like education as a system, or how it overlaps with other systems, and then how do you kind of intervene into that system? I think that's a beautiful mindset. So I greatly appreciate your enterprise architect background, but I do want you set the foundation for like talking about like what we see, I guess, like education in United States today. And you mentioned the biggest national security crisis, which I want to double click on that. And if you can elaborate what you mean by that and why you say that, that would be great. And then I want to come back to kind of schooling versus learning. But yeah. Let's kick off with the crisis.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is both hope and bright spots. Sure. And I think there are places where we know that access and opportunity is not equally distributed. And we have a lot of young people who, in that systems architecture, are choosing not to be in school, are choosing not to be in learning environments, are struggling to find meaning in communities right now, to have secure and stable mental health, and to feel connected to their community, whether that's around learning or whether that's around their own development. And so I see this with my own kids. I think it's really important to name, like, I'm a mom of an 8-year-old and 11-year-old, and who, one was in a schooling system in COVID-19 pandemic. We almost quit kindergarten, and watching my son have to struggle with online kindergarten that was not developmentally appropriate and not scaled to the learning sciences and development was a real struggle for me. And I see this in his cohort, this need to sort of retrench, retrain, reconnect young people in ways that help them form those meaningful connections with others in their class across diverse perspectives, and to be able to engage in dialogue. And then with my daughter, who was, younger at the time, I see a real difference actually in the way that they are able to relate to their peers and even just the foundational learning they have. And the reality is that we have young people across this country and across the globe who are not finding meaningful identity and agency in our schooling system. And so I think we need to be really thinking about, what are we designing schooling for? And what are we thinking about when we want to evolve schooling to learning experiences? And is the purpose of school to just think through core knowledge, or is it about the meaningful connections that young people create with peers? Is it about the ability to engage in discourse and dialogue with folks who are different from them, and the ability to build that persistence, that resilience, so that they can be, for example, critical consumers of AI, or feel like they can fail safely, the types of things that I think increasingly young people need to be able to navigate. And the reason I say it's a national security crisis is because I've worked in countries where young people are meaningfully disengaged from work, are displaced from work, places where 30% of the working population is unemployed. And that type of economic and social instability often leads to conflict, often leads to societies that are really struggling to navigate really important core issues around democratic values. And so I think we often in this country think that education is just a local responsibility. But for me, education is the key to our economic competitiveness, our national security, and the ability for young people to flourish and thrive, and to have a society where we can have productivity and social good reinforcing each other.
Oh my God. Well, first of all, as a mother of an almost 8-year-old, I remember thinking about this, right? Like
Yeah,
I feel like, oh, we lucked out,
totally.
like by a few years because
By just a couple years. Yeah.
and the fact that you said you see the difference, I think that's very, very, I mean, we assume that, but like living that is a very different experience. And I love that you emphasize meaningful connections and community for school. And to your point, I think in a day and age where, well, obviously we have kind of, I guess digital like access issues still, but like in growing access to information tools, creative tools, learning tools, right? What is a school for? And to your point, there's a lot of difference between like mental models, like building mental models, building values, building critical thinking, building relationships, and schools being the hub for that rather, schooling on
Yeah.
core study. And I think it's interesting because like I'm sure like looking at kind of the educational system, you see what the educational system delivers for like a country, right? And it's like, how do we bring up like good citizens and like good people? Whereas I wonder when you zoom in kind of like a school-based model, you still see, well, either like more attention to academic rigor, or basically to your point, like maybe struggling with resources if it's like an issue, like if there's like access issues or economic issues in the area, that especially in public school system, or very, even if you go to like a top school, like still relying on very much standardized methods of like maybe assessment, which like into your point, in a time where our work models are shifting, where like work is shifting, way we access information is shifting. Do we really still rely on those assessment methods? Or, you know, or going to the extreme, I don't know what they're called, but these schools like, oh, we teach with AI for 2 hours and the rest you're playing. Like, first of all, I have no interest in sending my child to a first version prototype of a school. But at the same time, like going back to what you said around relationships and community, do we understand what that replaces, or does it really take time to build that by doing that? So I think in a school base, like there's the like kind of overarching goal of what the educational system should deliver. And the implementation, the school-based implementation seems very scattered, or they can have these like kind of their own goals of whatever that is, which then are we really meeting those like core things that you said, like delivers for a nation, or for like for just realizing good humans. So I'm curious to see, and we talked about this a little bit kicking off, like even if we align on the vision of what the educational system is delivering for a country, what do you see in kind of the local or school-based implementation of it? Or like any challenges around implementing that? Like what gets in the way, even if schools do align on that vision?
Yeah, I mean, I when I hear you reflect on that, I think about the advice I give my own kids, which is like, do you have experiences where you're actually uncomfortable? Like, are you in the friction? And that friction, whether that's in the productive struggle of like pushing yourself around something you do not know, or being in experiences where you are meeting new people who are different from you, or trying new things where it's frustrating. I
Yeah.
think what we have to remember is that the science of learning and development tells us that that learning, that development happens in the friction, in the struggle.
Right.
And so I think a lot about, are we creating models at local levels that are actually about just making people comfortable and not actually introducing deliberate discomfort, deliberate friction, deliberate diversity, if you will, both in the model itself. So if we're talking about Alpha School and the 2 hours a day of just like, you can knock out all that core knowledge in 2 hours, like, is that why we're building core knowledge? And frankly, I have deep concerns as I look at the evidence base and the research around the design of models that are just about using AI to acquire knowledge. That is not actually working. I think what the evidence base and early research is telling us is that over the long term, you experience the inability to retain that knowledge over time. And so the core skills that I talked about, like connecting knowledge across domains, being a systems thinker, being able to level up to see the interconnectivity of our ecosystem, whether you're a biology major or whether you're an artist or whether you're somebody who eventually does the weather on TV. You have to be able to understand how systems interact, how multiple inputs interact. And so when I think about model diversity at schools, which I think is actually a good thing, I think young people need to be able to anchor around different models for learning. I think we need to be thinking about and interrogating if those models are about convenience and comfort, or are they about what we already know about the science of learning and development. And if we aren't thinking about interrogating both existing systems and new models and systems around what does it actually take for a young person to thrive and to flourish over the long term, then we are going to continue to have a system which has unequal outcomes for all learners. And so right now, I think we have to confess that the schooling system that we have built is not serving all young people.
Right.
And it's serving actually a pretty narrow band of young people well. And it's what resources that you have out of school that can move that narrow band to feel successful. And so, what does it look like to actually move to a systems and a structure that are much more pluralistic,
Right.
are much more focused on what young people say they want and need, which is job embedded learning experiences, which is the ability to do project-based learning, which is the ability to not have to like sit there and take a test to demonstrate what they know, but to be able to demonstrate what they know by doing. And actually, that's much more the things that when I talk to Fortune 500 CEOs, I hear from them is, I don't need to hire somebody who is just a cog in the machine.
Right.
I need to be thinking about how I'm hiring to have somebody who can manage a team. And increasingly, one of those teammates is going to need to be technology and AI. And so what does it mean to be able to interrogate the systems that are AI augmented, human-centered systems?
Yeah, this is so great. And if I go back to first we started around friction, like to your point, and the gratitude also like both like learning and the kind of the life skills and psychological benefits of that fiction, not maybe in the moment, but as the outcome, right? Like I see my daughter protesting on homework, but when she's done with it, like I see it in her eyes, the pride, or like if she's like trying to learn a piece on piano, she's like complaining the first song, and then like after she's done, like she's just like the joy that comes with that. And I think it's so interesting to observe that. And I think maybe for parents and like maybe early childhood educators, like it's more like easier for them to see that live, like what the benefits of that friction in the learning process. And I feel like if you don't have that professional or lived experience of advising and building these systems, are we really like seeing that? And this is, I guess, like, I see, and also I even like, I'm an educator, but more in graduate school, right? So in that, I even can see if a student has used AI significantly versus like using it as a tool, you can see there is even lack of understanding in the own problem area that they're addressing, right? To your point on like actually AI getting in the way of learning. And these are much older students who did do the learning early on, and like now introducing AI, and even it happens that fast, right?
Yeah.
That we just decide to give it away. And then really already opting into the frictionless aspect of it. And maybe this is like multiple layered soft infrastructures over the course of like history, right? Like we became the generation of like convenience, and we want seamless interactions, and we want everything now and on demand, and all of the above kind of like created this perfect storm for us to just like, oh yeah, I want everything to be frictionless. So is my relationship. So is my like personal, like I one time asked my students in a class, and these are all graduate students, and majority of them were using ChatGPT as a therapist. And when I asked why, of course, number one is like it's free, right? Obviously, there's an underlying reason for this symptom. But the second answer is that because it gets them, it understands them. And you're kind of like,
but it doesn't. And that's like, it's not a thing. It's like, it's not a person.
Yeah,
it is
even
a
therapist's job is not to get you.
That's
like,
right.
Like when do you go to therapy and they're like, oh, I agree. That's in fact, you should be more frustrated. It's like work when you go to therapy, right? So I already see kind of in like a year, right? Like what does that do to young minds still? But even with younger minds, when your brain is like still shaping, right? we don't even understand the implications of that. Like if we're seeing already our brain is basically idle, we're underutilizing some parts, we're getting in the way of learning in older brains. What would that mean for younger brains when we're already starting that so early on? And I think I 100% agree with what you're saying in like being very cautious in all of the introduction in these things. And what you said also around basically a successful system almost should have unequal outcomes, like going back to like equality was never equity, right? Like equality
That's
was
right.
like easier to implement probably. Like that's our like everything that we try to standardize and like standardize methods, and it's just easier for implementation. But to be able to really deliver an inclusive experience for students, it doesn't necessarily mean make it frictionless for them, right? Like, and I think that is also like one thing that I think we should clarify or reframe, because sometimes when we talk about inclusive experiences, like, oh, everything comes in easy for everybody. Like, actually not, right? Like,
Yeah, actually not, right?
not.
Like it is one thing. It's like, we talk about the struggle, right? Like my mom always used to say, like, you're learning and growing when it's painful. And that's like a bit of wisdom that like
Yeah,
I now,
like
repeat to
growing
my
pains.
kids
Yeah.
is, you're learning when it's painful. When you're growing, it's painful. And for me, I think this is the thing that I see is, if we don't help young people understand when they get knocked down, how they get off the mat and
Mm,
how fast they get off the mat is the thing that matters. That resilience, that persistence, as they're navigating societal uncertainty, personal uncertainty, like when you get broken up with for the
yeah.
first time, when you get fired from your first or a job, um when you encounter that friction and it knocks you down, how do you get back up? And if we can't have strong neural networks
Yeah.
that build that persistence, right, the ability to connect experiences, to knit those together. I started by saying it was a long and winding path. That path was not smooth.
Yeah.
Like that was not a smooth, like, rainbows and leprechauns path in my career. I faced, big challenges. And I'll just name that, like, some of those are identity challenges. I'm a woman in technology in the early aughts, that you could like put four of us in a room. And that was like the significant, technology capacity at the highest echelons of government was, like four women, and just like there's identity challenges, like how are you resilient and confident, and that wasn't always the case for me. I wanted to be a computer science major at University of Michigan as a freshman. I went to my first computer science class. I stuck it through for 8 weeks, and then the professor came to me and told me I was a distraction because I was the only female in the class, and I needed to drop it, or didn't I want to drop it? And I tell that story not because I stuck with it, but because I did drop it. And I became a poli-sci econ and sociology major. And I only went back later and, became and did computer science and became an enterprise architect. But I even, who I am now as sort of a confident leader in this space, was knocked down and didn't get back up in the same way. And I tell that story not because I, want to talk about women and identity politics and things like that, but everybody gets knocked down.
Right.
Everybody has to think about how they get back up. And the thing I think I'm worried about right now, when I see the rate of mental health crisis in our young people in different cohorted levels, not just below 18, but our, 18 to 22-year-olds, our 22 to 25-year-olds, even our 25, to 35-year-olds, mental like illness is at an all-time high. And how are we going to equip young people to have some of that resilience and that support so that they're not going to an AI bot for therapy, that they're actually doing the work to build those resilience, those persistence, and those skills. And that is about education for sure. That's about meaningful connections to adults, knowing where to go and when to ask for help. But it's also about how we're thinking about the system that makes us human. And
Right.
so much of the work that I'm focused on right now, whether that's at the EdSafe AI Alliance or it's work I'm doing, to think through new models of data infrastructure, things that don't feel super sexy, but all are about how do we have a more holistic view of
Yeah.
all learners.
Yeah. And I think it's to your point, like it's so tied in the end, like as a young adult or like when you're in your early 30s, when you go through a crisis or a situation, and yes, like we should get back up and then we obviously learn from every experience and it's great in the moment, acknowledging that it might suck, right?
Really suck.
In that moment, though, if early on in schools, the way you went through these things, right? Like, because you fight with friends at school, maybe you
Sure.
fail the class, something happens. If you had a community to rely on, right? Like, you know who to go to at the school if you have a problem with this. If you are having an issue, maybe with a friend, a school counselor helps. Like, if you kind of grow up with this like human infrastructure to like support you through the conflicts, I would assume like when you're in your 30s and you go through that, you don't like, let me opt into this like bot to tell me, like,
Right.
so
Right. And actually,
well
we have good
connected.
data about
Yeah.
this. So we have really good data about the difference between when a young person has a meaningful connection with someone in a school-based setting. This is Surgeon General research from the previous administration. They are 33% less likely to experience suicidal ideation. So one meaningful connection with an adult, and I'm not even talking about a teacher. I'm talking about like a coach, a tutor, the janitor, the school secretary in the school setting. They a 33% reduction in suicidal ideation. Incredible reduction. When we compare that to an AI bot or companion like Replica, when they released research, they talked about a astonishing 3% reduction in suicidal ideation. So actually, we have a real choice right now.
Right.
Are we going to choose 33% or are we going to choose 3%? And that's how I crystallize the choice we have before us as a society. Are we going to double down on the human infrastructure that we know allows young people and all learners, not just young people? I think there's a crisis of loneliness, in our older population right now as well, which makes them particularly vulnerable for misinformation, disinformation, and all sorts of exploitation. But also, are we going to choose 3 or 33? I think that's the real choice. I'm choosing 33. I'm choosing as a parent, as a mother, as an educator, as an activist, as an advocate, to really push the conversation towards that 33%, that doubling down on the models that are inherently human, on the skills that are inherently human. And I think those are the investments that mean we have a more secure country, we have a more prosperous country, and frankly, we have a thriving society.
Yeah. And I think in that decision, we're also, our approach as a country is very capitalistic in every way possible. So when we talk about AI, it's a lot around efficiency and productivity, and you're kind of like, to what end or why? But like, it's harder to question that in a corporate environment because it's like, oh, shareholder value, whatever, right? But then we don't necessarily have to carry on that mindset into education. Like to your point, I think human nature is all about processes, right? Evolution is a process, growth is a process, learning is a process. And we don't even know, or everyone, to your point, like going back to these like pluralistic experiences too, everyone has their own synthesis of that process. Like when I go through, it's like, I could get a AI summary of a book and I would get the gist of it, but I would only generate the insights that I would if I read that book because of my own past experience, my view of
Mhm.
the world. Like, and then I would miss out on the opportunity of the insights that I got from reading a book. Like, I remember I did this experiment when ChatGPT first came out. I love this book called Loon Shots. I don't know if you, from Safi Bakal, it's a great,
Yeah, it's a great one.
and I remember as a practitioner, educator, reading that book, I had so many like sparks and insights coming to my mind just reading that book, right? And then when ChatGPT came out, I had it summarize that book for me. The areas that it highlighted were not even the areas that really triggered something in me, right? Like it was just a general synopsis of this is what it talks about and these are the main points. I'm like, yeah, but it wasn't that main point that really allowed me to think through this, which helped me in that, right? Like, so I think we're this efficiency mindset is kind of having us eliminate processes that we normally
Mhm.
go through, which then it helps us with like synthesizing things or learning in our own way. And I'm just like, my biggest worry, I guess, in this, and when I see kind of the grants coming out around incorporating AI into education and things like that, my biggest concern then becomes, is that efficiency mindset going to be carried out into educational systems, which I think educational systems need to leave that space for processes to happen, right? It's not necessarily like, I don't know how we make learning, like schooling can be efficient, but like learning, I don't know if it should be efficient.
Right.
And so I'm curious your thoughts on or reflection is like, this educational system being within a bigger system that is, especially in this day and age, very much geared towards like productivity,
Yeah.
efficiency, all of that. How do
Yeah.
we, how do we protect it?
I have lots of thoughts here. I mean, one thing I'll say is I think you are exactly right that right now AI tools are doing exactly what they're built for, which is like they are being rewarded by capital markets, by
Yeah.
investors for productivity and efficiency. In fact, the three biggest measures of your capital investment are our productivity measures. Like, how long does it take an agent to replace this task? What's the minimum wage of someone to complete this task? Is it cheaper for an agent to do that or a human to do that? That is literally how foundational models are being evaluated right now by investors, by capital markets, and by the sort of capital that is being deployed at massive measure. Like we're about to witness like the largest set of IPOs in the capital markets around AI, whether that's Anthropic,
Yeah.
the SpaceX IPO. It's just like we are looking at a massive amount of wealth going towards human replacement, task replacement. And that is not me being alarmist. That is actually what is happening
Right.
in our capital markets. And so the question is, can we bend the arc? Can we, particularly in education, can we bend the arc so that the tools that are being used in education are anchored around the learning sciences, are anchored around that work? And what does that look like? And so at EdSafe AI right now, along with Arizona State University, we're building a learning sciences benchmark to evaluate the foundational models and how well they do across 12 domains. We'll release it in early fall of this year. And folks can go on the edsafeai.org website and see who's working with us on this. Amazing folks like Roy P. and Rose Lecken. But also folks who are coming from across domains, from healthcare, from national security, and students, and educators, folks who are actually in classrooms, students who are in the learning enterprise right now. And what that looks like is going to be really, really important. So I encourage people to follow that work. I think so we need to change the yardstick. If we want models to look different, we need to measure and interrogate them around what we already know from the research and evidence base. And that means we need to replace a human replacement benchmark with a learning sciences benchmark, particularly when we're looking at AI and education tools. And, I think the thing that we can absolutely say right now about this work is my educated hypothesis
Yeah.
is that we're gonna see foundational models not scoring really high when it comes to echoing the learning sciences, because again, the incentives are around human and task replacement, around how many positions can you cut, how many people can you cut, and what are the long-term implications of that. We're already seeing that displacement happen for 22 to 25-year-olds. I think the Stanford AI Index gives us some really good data around that's not coming, that is here. The entry, the early rungs on that entry career ladder are disappearing or are gone.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the work we're thinking about with governors and here in the US, but also with governments around the world, is what are the types of infrastructure and learning experiences, and then the signaling credentials you need to have or create to give young people 22 to 25 those replacement learning experiences
Right.
that used to be, the first things in the early career ladder. And I think about this from my own experience. When I started in technology, my job on the team, on the Scrum team, was to check other people's code. It's the worst job. Okay. It is the worst job because you are just, first of all, like spending hours, and sometimes something's broken and you're looking for a needle in a haystack. There were parts of my identity that I really loved. Like I'm a problem solver. I'm a puzzler. I'm an unearther. So that was super valuable for me. But do you know what it also taught me that had nothing to do with code? Was I was working with much more senior engineers on the team, and my job was to check their code. And what was really interesting about that is I had to learn how to go talk to them about mistakes they had made.
Exactly.
I had to package my feedback for them, not just in you did something wrong, but why did you structure it this way? And here's how I think that structure is actually creating technical debt further down the line. That was the most valuable thing I learned in that work. It wasn't like how to check SQL or other languages, right? It was about how I related to humans, how I interrogated the work, and then how I was able to take that and enlist them in being a partner in fixing that work. And those are really valuable skills that right now are not happening when AI and are not being developed in the folks who are going to need to lead software development teams further down the line. In fact, most code is now being checked and reauthored by AI itself. And so that task replacement is very, very heavy there. But I worry about then who's going to be the Scrum Master,
Right.
who's going to be the project manager, who's going to be able to be the orchestrator of the system and of the code down the line. And so I think about my own experience and how do we understand that in that sacrifice of productivity and efficiency, we have to think about how we cultivate those skills, or we will pay the piper, whether that's in coding or other, or the legal profession, or with doctors, or with teachers down the line, if they're not using those very early career experiences to experience that friction, both around the real tactical skill, but also in the way that they learn and develop with others.
I absolutely love that example. I think it's a perfect summary of everything, like how you develop kind of communication skills, tactical skills, confidence, storytelling skills. Like, what do I say to people, how, right? Or to who and how. And when your metrics are like KPIs around like, how much faster, at what cost? And I think we're at a time, if you ask that, you're like treated like the Debbie Downer in the room. Like, oh, you're
totally, you're the
AI.
doomer. You're the doomer.
Yeah. Doomer. You're against innovation. And
Yeah.
I just asked the question, so everything around humans, like talking about humans, very controversial. But I think like that is and I see this as a educator for like graduate school too, like, entry level jobs, much harder to find,
Really hard.
internships disappearing. And so also as a nation, at what cost this like, let's get rich and fast. And also like, who is that benefiting? Like that's a whole other podcast maybe.
Yeah.
But at what cost is it coming considering your next generations are, you know, kind of we're deteriorating these like human skills or life skills because we need to be efficient and money making and fast, like today as companies. And so I think like I started to talk about this a lot with like program chairs as well around how, well, at least at a higher education level, more like almost like apprenticeship models
Yeah.
that have programs and education systems have built in internships, right? Like that early education. And you talked about in like more earlier childhood, like project-based learning, learning by doing, basically carrying that into higher ed. So by the time you're complete at school, it almost is like you have a few years of like experience, right? But
Hmm.
I'm curious to hear from you what models you're seeing out there or from the work that you're doing, any other examples you want to give, especially knowing that I think we're in like a semi-crisis of this like early career space, like
Yeah.
internships, junior positions. So curious to get your thoughts on that or what you're observing work that's being done to address that.
Yeah, I just read some great research from our colleagues over at Stanford around like actually some bright spots we're having about young people taking more AP classes, more
Mhm.
kids in CTE, that type of thing. And it's from Michael Kirst and Victor Chan. They just released it, I think, in the last couple days. Really great research, and I'll send you the paper so you
Yeah,
can put it
that'd
in
be
the show
great.
notes. So there's some bright spots there, right? Like I think there's a recognition that we in the K-12 system, at least, need to be thinking more about, and with intentionality, the link from K-12 to higher ed to workforce experiences, and that we need to be thinking about what structures are built. There's some big gaps too. I want to point out that Michael and Victor point out some, a real agenda for us to get our act together if that's the vision we want for young people, is to have a more holistic, connected experience, whether that's data infrastructure or being able to do some really simple things around getting credit for work-based learning experiences in higher
Mm,
education. That isn't just work study. That's not just your financial aid, right? That's
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
actually a set of competencies and dispositions. So I see some great models that are happening out there in the educator apprenticeship space. I want to call out Ball State's incredible example of how they're thinking about building a teacher pipeline. And the reason I tell this story is because of the thing I said earlier about failure. They work with juniors and seniors in high school in local communities to begin to get experience around whether or not they want to be teachers by putting them in work embedded experiences and after school programs with partners like Boys and Girls Club. And then they're not all those students who do that in junior and senior year say, hey, I want to go to Ball State and I want to get a teaching degree. And in fact, they see that as a victory. They see that as like, if you get that experience and you decide you don't want to be a teacher, actually, that's a great outcome for us, because over the long term, it means that their retention and matriculation rates are actually higher. Their persistence rates are
Yeah.
higher. They're testing for that like experience very early on. And then those young people go on to become certified teachers with masters in just 3 years using an apprenticeship model, always earning and learning while they're becoming certified teachers who generally stay in their community or within their region. And so I love that experience, not just because it's about education, but because it's purposeful in the on ramps and off ramps that it's creating for young people. And then at EdSafe AI, we partnered with Voices for National Service, the partnership for student success, and City Year to talk about and release a paper around how national service could be an answer in the United States for helping young people have those meaningful learning experiences out of high school or post-secondary. And again, I'll send the paper so your listeners can dig into it. But what would that look like in the age of AI to take an existing service infrastructure that exists in every state in this country, some opportunities in education, some in climate science, some in healthcare. AmeriCorps has this really interesting diversity of programs. And what would it look like to create those on-ramps for young people who are struggling potentially to find that next step in the career ladder and to go into national service, to be exposed to service, to communities that look different than theirs, to have to work with people who look different than they do, to build those competencies and dispositions. It's such a interesting, I think, concept for us to not think we have to build a new national infrastructure, but how do we think about, dare I say, a new deal for America's youth using national service, not unlike a hearkening back to the last time we experienced massive industrial destabilization in this country. And so, can we be students of history and think about and those, experiences that, whether they were coming out of the New Deal or World War II or the GI Bill, that really structured these on-ramps and off-ramps for reinvesting in our society, in our economy, and in our national security. And so I'll send that paper along. I think it is very thought-provoking about what's the infrastructure that we already have that we could invest in today to meet this moment, but also really purposeful about what we want for a society in the future.
I love that. And I think that kind of bridged into very well the last part I have as a question on what would be your advice, because I think you sprinkled it through. But I guess to anyone who is trying to make progress, do purposeful work, right? And I think, again, your feedback and conversation, everything was very much adviceful. If that's a word, adviceful, that's a good word.
New word. We'll make it a word.
We'll make it a word.
Webster's does that every year, so we can do it too. How about that? Exactly.
So anything you want to add to everything that you just said?
Yeah, I think the thing that marks the success that InnovateEDU has had across all of our alliances is that we deliberately build and bring together uncommon allies. It's that idea of comfort and uncomfort, being a little bit uncomfortable in what it means to find and build common ground. And so I think that right now is more important than ever, that in a time of deep polarization in our country and in our world, how are we reaching down to that mat for folks who have stumbled? How are we reaching across the aisle politically, but also how are we listening first to a diversity of challenges, opinions, and perspectives as we're thinking about what we want for the future? And so this idea that, I want to encourage everyone to think about one way that they can be uncomfortable in the next day, in the next week, in the next month, whether that's a book you might not read, whether that's a news channel you might not always listen to. How are you making yourself uncomfortable and introducing that friction back into your life?
As a co-design practitioner, educator, advocate, I love the uncommon allies and just working in co-creation with such allies. And I think noting down, even reminding myself, just embracing some discomfort every now and then. We obviously, as humans, we tend to jump in comfort zones very fast and want to stay it's nice and cozy. So I think that's a great reminder for everyone. But especially I think young minds going into different spaces too. So Erin, I think I can talk to you all day.
Oh, that's so sweet. What a pleasure. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much for making the time. This was so insightful and wonderful.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I love the conversation. And thank you to your listeners for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. And subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. And don't forget to join us next week. See you.